The third class of models that we will discuss is the hybrid models, and they will create local image representations. Actually, we've seen this quite a bit in the lecture where we discussed feature extraction. It has three different parts. First, we will detect points of interest. These points can be corners, can be detected using blob detection. Second, around each point of interest, a local feature will be extracted that describes the intensity pattern in that region. For instance, given an image like this, we detect all the corners that are indicated with the white dots here. Then, around each interest point, we create an area and we extract a feature, a vector that describes the intensity pattern in that. For each interest point, we extract another feature. The last part that we did not actually discuss in the feature extraction lecture was the matching. In the matching, we will determine correspondences between two different scenes to identify whether enough interest points and enough descriptors match between the images. For instance, given these two images, we will identify all possible matches. And in the end, if there are enough matches, we will say that, okay, this image contains this object. More technically, the example that we looked at was from Schmidt and Moore from 1997 on Euclidean invariant features. The algorithm has two parts. One of them is training, where we create the database, and the second is the testing. In the training part, the first point is to identify the points of interest. In the work of Schmidt and Moore, the simplest interest points is used, which are the corners that are detected with Harris corner detector. Around each interest point, circular regions are taken of different radii to cope a little bit with scale changes, to have some robustness to scale differences. Within the circular regions, we'll calculate features that are invariant under planar rotation. And we do this from different points, different viewpoints of the same image, so that we gain some robustness towards the number of views needed. Notice that because we take circular regions and we take features that are invariant to rotation, we don't need different rotations of the same scene. However, the model, the interest points, the regions, nor the features, none of them are robust to other affine transformations for which we need multiple viewpoints. So that's for training. We basically, for all the images in our training dataset, we extract all the interest points. From all the interest points, we extract features and create a very large database of interest points and the corresponding features. During testing, we do the same thing for a test image. We identify the interest points and we extract the features around the interest points. Then we compare these features with those found in our database. And we do this for each image. We basically compare the number of good matches between our test image and each of the training images. Now, you can imagine that there are many matches, especially if we consider the local regions. So we have to prune out the matches that doesn't make any sense, that are basically spurious correspondences. For that, we look for consistent placements of the candidate matches using geometric constraints, for example, assuming that there's an epipolar transformation between the two images, which allows us to prune out matches that should not be there. Based on the number of remaining matches that are consistent with the geometric transformation we assume, we decide which object should be in the image. Schmidt and Moore used rotation invariant features, and they proposed two of them. One of them were these Gaussian derivatives, which we've seen before. It was basically a product of the x derivative and plus the y derivatives. The second example was the second order Gaussian derivatives, where they added gxx, so the second order x derivatives and the second order y derivatives. Now, we've seen that both of these features are actually rotating invariant. Now, they are not robust to scale differences, so that's why you need to take multiple regions of interest at different radii to gain such robustness. For example, let's look at one very simple example. Assume that we have this dinosaur in our training set. And for this dinosaur, we have images of various viewpoints. Schmidt and Moore's algorithm is able to identify in this image the dinosaur and the pose that it corresponds to. For instance, here it's shown with the red image, the red bounding box. Notice that the algorithm only looks for local image features. Therefore, it's able to deal with the cluttered background. It needs less training images because of the robustness to the transformations that these features and interest points have. However, it also assumes that I'm able to really extract good interest points. So if I had objects with uniform intensity patterns, the algorithm might have difficulty in identifying the interest points and find correspondences. Now, the hybrid models that we've seen are rather compact models. So they don't really have to have a very large model that grabs the entire image. They can deal with clutter and partial occlusion because I only need to match certain parts of the object to decide whether it's present or not. They can be made quite efficient, and we'll see that next. The models are easy to produce. Just like in the case of the PCA, I only use the images and I extract features from the images to represent the local areas. Furthermore, it can use fewer images than pure appearance-based models that we've seen before because the models themselves are somehow robust to rotation, somehow robust to scale differences, and they can be robust to occlusion and clutter. We can actually create such models for a rather wide class of objects, actually almost as wide as it was the case for pure appearance-based models, but we wouldn't have a problem with objects that have very uniform intensity patterns, so untextured objects in a sense. And though we didn't discuss it in depth, there is a lot of room for improving the invariance properties to various geometric and photometric transformations. Now, until this point, extraction of the features we've seen before. So the only thing that we've seen here, extra from 2 weeks before lecture, was the matching part. So let's discuss this matching part further. Specifically, we will talk about two different components that make hybrid models really robust and efficient to use in practice. These are the visual words and the indexing that will allow us to do matching very, very fast, even when we have a very large database. And the second part is the run-cycle algorithm that allows us to impose geometric constraints to get rid of spurious matches and correspondences very fast. So let's first talk about the first part, which is the visual words. Now, we want to support the matching step. And we talked about the fact that if I want to do matching in a naive way, for each test image, I have to compare all the features extracted from the test image with all the images in my training database. Now, this can be really, really slow. So what can we do to actually improve its speed? The critical point or the underlying principle that we will use is we will use hierarchical vocabulary trees to speed up the matching process. Now, as we've discussed, with potentially thousands of interest points and their descriptors per image and hundreds to millions of images to search in our database, how can we make it efficient? First, we will quantize or create clusters of descriptors, and we will call them the visual words. Second, we will create a vocabulary tree to match words in a hierarchical manner to make it really fast. And lastly, we will use an inverted file indexing scheme that will allow us to do matching really efficiently. So let's see each of these concepts one by one. First one is the visual word or the quantization idea. So from each image, we will extract some local features. So we will first find the interest points. For example, these are the interest points and the patches around the interest points in this image. From each of them, I will extract features. Let's assume that I use SIFT, so I get 128 dimensional features from each area here. Now, for the purpose of illustration, I will map everything to 2D here. So let's assume that each of these points actually lie down in this feature space. So each of these points represent an area in the image, or the features of the area in the image. Now, when I get new images, I will map them to my feature space, and they will be represented as additional points in the feature space. As I have more images, I will have more and more features. And every additional image will lead to additional interest points, additional regions, and that will populate my feature space. So in the end, I will have a lot of points in my feature space. Now notice that each point is a local descriptor, for example, a SIFT vector that corresponds to a patch of an image in one of the training images I have. So in theory, with millions of images, you can have many, many points in your feature space. The idea is we want to create clusters in this space and use only the centers of the clusters to represent the entire group. How can we do clustering? The easiest way is to use k-means clustering. We basically randomly initialize k cluster centers chosen from the samples that we have, chosen from the points, assign each feature to the nearest cluster center. We will recompute the cluster center mean and iterate from step 2 until convergence. This will provably create a good clustering and will give us k cluster centers. Second, we don't want to do it basically if we have, for instance, millions of images that leads to hundreds of millions of feature points. We don't want to create very large number of clusters all at once. Instead, we want to create a hierarchical clustering. So first, we use, for example, 3 clusters, and then within each cluster, we create 3 additional clusters and iterate this for several times. This allows actually creating very large vocabularies. In the example here, k equals to 3, but usually k is chosen to be 10. So if I repeat this process 6 times, that will already give me 10 to the 6 clusters. So that's pretty neat. I have 10 to the 6 clusters, so I can have a lot of representation power, and I can really, each cluster will really specialize in a certain region or a certain type of region that's seen in the images. Let's have a visual example for this. For example, this cluster, what I show here in these images on the right-hand side are 4 groups that show different cluster center or different samples that fall into the same cluster. For instance, here, if I assume that this cluster corresponds to this, I notice that all these images roughly show similar patterns in the images, similar local areas. So you see that they're all vary differently, but they're very similar. So in the clustering, a hierarchical clustering algorithm that I've shown, each of them will be represented with a single cluster center or a single visual word, and the visual word corresponds to such an image patch. Now, this group will correspond to a different cluster center, and this group will correspond to a different cluster center, and so on. So that's how you build hierarchical clusters and use the visual words. The last thing that we have to use to get a very efficient system is the indexing local features using inverted file index. Now, if you have a book or any text document, a very efficient way to find all pages on which a word occurs is to use the index at the back. So you can actually look at the word, for example, in Everglade, and you see that this word actually is used on pages 90, 95, 139 to 140, 154, 160. Now we want to apply the same thing in the images. Here, instead of finding pages, we want to find images in which a visual word occurs. So how can we get this? We create the image-based inverted file index. So we have a database of images, and from each of these images, we extract multiple regions with multiple features. So each of these features will correspond to a word, a visual word, in the clustering scheme that we showed. So we want to create a large table where for each visual word, we will actually record down the image numbers that they appear in our database. For example, the word 1 is actually appearing once only in image 3, while the word 7 appears both in image 1 and image 2. So word 7 will correspond to the image number 1 and 2, and so on. Now, when we have now a query image, and from the query image, we basically look at the extract one of the features, we can actually find the visual word that corresponds to that feature, and then look at the other images in our training database which has the same word. So a new query image is mapped to the indices of database images that share a word. And now you can imagine that if I have an image, and if I extract multiple words from this image, the database image that shares the largest number of words with this query image should have the same object. And this, now we can actually put everything together and use the inverted file index with the vocabulary tree to create a very fast retrieval system. For instance, let's assume that I have 4 different training images. In all of them, I have several features. Now, I basically took these features and created a vocabulary tree, okay, with different 3 layers. Now, and I also create an inverted files index saying that for each of these visual words, or the cluster centers, I record down the images that that visual word appears in. Now, given a query image, I will extract features. I will find the corresponding visual word by basically running down the vocabulary tree, and then I will look at the images in the database that share the same word, and I will increment one index or their index by 1. I will do it for another feature in the query image, do exactly the same thing, and then yet another feature in the query image, the same thing. Now notice that this image shares words with all the images in my database. However, it shares the largest number of words with the image that has exactly the same object. Now this gives us an extremely efficient retrieval system. It actually has been evaluated on very large databases, indexing up to 1 million images. For example, it has been used in online recognition for databases of 50,000 CD covers. And even in that very large number of images, retrieval can be done in 1 second, extremely fast. And best results are obtained with very large visual vocabularies. Now, here we use very large visual vocabularies because we want to really describe every small detail within an image. Very, very detailed representation. If we were to talk about object category or object class recognition, we would have actually used a smaller smaller vocabulary to basically gain a little bit of invariance to the small changes in the visual words. But we will talk more about that later. Okay, so that was the first part. Through building visual words, through building vocabulary trees, and through using an inverted indexing system, we could really make the matching process extremely efficient. However, we didn't really talk about the spurious matches yet. If done naively, every image, every query image will output many, many interest points, leading to many features, and each of these features will essentially match to an object. Okay, now we will find the training image. Basically, we will find a training image that has the large number of matches with the test image. But even in this case, only finding the training image based on the local descriptors can actually misguide us. What we need to do is we need to identify correct matches and only use them to identify the object. So what does that mean? For example, in matching this image to this one here, the dots and the lines shows us all different matching words. So here dot corresponds to one visual word, and it's drawn with the line, and the line corresponds to a visual word on this image. So you see that actually if I compare these two images, because the texture is very, very complicated, I have many, many different matches. Obviously, most of these matches are not correct because, well, between these two scenes, there must be some kind of a geometric transformation. So what we need to do is we need to impose some constraints saying that, you know what, I only have to take into account the matches, the correspondences between these two images, that all obey a certain transformation. And only those I should take into account, not all the matches. One algorithm that makes this extremely fast is RANSAC. That's Random Sample Consensus. So the matching can start from interest points and descriptors, but as we've seen, such matching can be rather fragile because it will match many, many noisy patterns, many spurious matches, and just relying on that for recognizing objects might not be extremely robust. Typically, several matches are simply wrong. They're called the outliers, and we need to add a test on the configuration of the matches so that we remove these outliers and only keep the correct one, the correct inliers, to decide on the object. To that, we basically say that we will assume an epipolar geometry or a projective geometry between the two images, and we will use such tests, and we will basically use the RANSAC algorithm to identify the correspondences that can be explained with a proper geometric transformation between the two images. So the RANSAC test on epipolar geometry assumes that there is a fundamental matrix that matches should agree with. So the RANSAC test with projectivity assumes that there is a projectivity that maps points in the first image onto the matching points in the second image. And these tests will allow us to eliminate many of the outliers. So the idea is rather simple. We will assume that the data consists of a certain inlier matches, so basically correct matches, and a number of outlier or incorrect matches. So the algorithm first randomly selects a minimal number of matches that is needed to formulate an initial test hypothesis. For example, I need 7 matches to create an epipolar geometry, or 4 matches to construct a projectivity between the two images. And this number better be small, since the selected tuple must not contain any outlier match for it to work. Based on this hypothesis, we will check all other matches in the image and compute the number of matches that agree with this transformation matrix. So every transformation matrix that is created in the first step will have somehow a support set, the number of matches that support that hypothesis. So using all the supporting matches, we can refine the hypothesis and we can discard the rest of the matches. So finally, RANSAC will select the hypothesis with the maximal support after a fixed number of trials or after sufficient support was reached. So we will actually run these 3 steps several times, and we will choose the match that has the largest support. One question might be, how often should we draw? Suppose actually we have these 4 variables. So n corresponds to the minimum number of data required to fit the model. K, the number of iterations or trials that need to be performed by the algorithm. T is the threshold to determine when a match fits the model. And D is the number of inliers needed for a model to be okay. So the T and D are actually user-defined parameters that are chosen beforehand. The number of iterations K can actually be calculated quite easily. Let us assume that we basically look at the probability that RANSAC at one of the trials will only select inliers for n data units, generating a test valid at least once. So the probability that the algorithm gets a good output. So when W is the proportion of inliers, and obviously that should be estimated, we can assume that, for example, 40% of the matches should be inliers in any given 2 scenes. Then we can compute K based on this probability here. So here we look at the probability that no good hypothesis will be selected in K runs. Okay? And you can imagine that actually as k increases, p will decrease. P will increase as well. So 1 minus p will decrease. So the probability that no good hypothesis is selected will decrease as k increases. So we can actually put a threshold here and say that we want to select or want to do so many trials such that the probability of no good hypothesis selected with the Ransack algorithm is, let's say, lower than 1 over 10,000 or something. Okay. Now, using the epipolar geometry with the Ransack algorithm, we can actually take all these matches and really clean them up and really find the matches that agree with an underlying geometric transformation matrix that links these two images. And only these matches should be taken into account when deciding the objects in the scene. Now, Ransack is extremely useful and used in practice quite often, but these tests also make strong assumptions about the scene. If we think about epipolar geometry, we assume the rigidity of the scene, meaning that the objects in the scene do not actually move with respect to each other. Now, when basically matching different landmarks, that's fine because landmarks are rigid structures. But if we are matching human body, that is a bit different case. If we assume even further projectivity, then we don't only assume that the scene is composed of rigid objects, but also the transformation or the objects in the scene are largely planar so that I can assume projective transformations. Anyway, despite these strong assumptions, Ransack is actually quite a useful algorithm. And these tests really help get rid of the spurious correspondences and have a robust recognition system.